We are so honored to have him and speak to us this morning. Many of us are proud of him. With a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, welcome with me, Professor PLO Lumumba. Let's stand up and receive Professor PLO Lumumba.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me say how happy I am to be in your presence this morning. I do not claim to be an authority on the subject that I've been requested to speak on and about, but I have thoughts to share with you, which thoughts I believe will be cross-fertilized by the thoughts of others during the panel discussion. But let me say at the very outset that the question of the commercialization of politics is one that is evergreen, particularly since the advent of multi-party politics in Africa. If you allow me a little latitude, prior to the re-emergence of multi-party politics in 1989, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which was the landmark historical event, we sometimes forget that many African countries did actually have many political parties at the advent of our regaining independence. And I use the word regaining our independence deliberately, because sometimes we behave as if we were not independent at all, and that we acquired our independence through the process of decolonization. The truth as we know it, prior to the advent of the European powers in the 18th and 19th centuries, Africa and Africans were independent. And then very harshly, courtesy of the history that we are all aware about, the European powers congregated in Berlin in 1884 and arbitrarily and harshly created different countries which we now claim to be citizens of. I was listening to a speech yesterday where somebody was saying, rather melodramatically, that a day before the conference in Berlin, two couples sleeping on one bed woke up the following day only to discover that the husband was a Ugandan and the wife was a Kenyan. The whole idea of that dramatization was to demonstrate how arbitrary the process of the partition of Africa was. We also know, and one need not belabor the issue, that no sooner had the process of colonization started than Africans started agitating for independence. And the struggle for independence was attended by violence in a number of African countries. And ultimately, we regained our independence. On the eastern coast of Africa, you will remember that there were efforts even in those early days, particularly through Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere, to delay Tanzania's independence so that Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was then, could regain independence as one country. But the leaders of Kenya, being Jomo Kenyatta and your own Apollo Milton Obote, thought otherwise. The net effect is that we regained our independence as separate African countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And you will remember that there was multi-party politics. And it's also instructive in those early days, whether we want to deny it or not, that those who are in the forefront of the struggle for independence at that time, notwithstanding that they committed certain mistakes thereafter, were animated by the desire to restore the dignity of the people. And one can argue here in Uganda, for example, that UPC or DP, which were the main political parties at that time, did represent certain clear ideological orientations. One can also say that in Kenya at that time, the Kenya African National Union and the Kenya Democratic Union did represent some clear ideological orientation. And I'm not using the word ideology in the classical sense to mean Marxism or Leninism or those other isms. I'm talking about using ideology loosely to refer to clarity on what independence meant and would mean for the people. That was also true in Tanzania through then Tanganyika African National Union. One can therefore say that in those early days, the leaders were animated by the desire to move their countries in the right direction and to restore the people's dignity. One need only look at the very casual works of some of the leaders at that time across the continent of Africa. Whether you are looking at the casual or the more serious works of Julius Nyerere, or looking and reading the more casual works of people like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, or you are reading the more casual works of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, or the more casual works of Kwame Nkrumah. And I'm using casual rather than serious to demonstrate that even when they were casual, they were committed to certain ideals, and that these ideals had one aim. So that when the leaders met in the month of May in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and one need only read the 32 speeches that were delivered by the 32 delegations led by either heads of states or heads of government or their representatives and the national movement, then to realize that there was clarity in the minds of Africans of the day. But there is one speech that stood out on that day, the speech of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. He was as animated, as agitated as he ought to have been in exhorting the leaders of the day that the safety of the African continent not only required but demanded on that day that Africa should move towards unity. And he reminded the people that the colonial project was still alive and well, and that it would come camouflaged as neo-colonialism. And he reminded the leaders that if they did not unite, the erstwhile colonial powers would come in a different way. Whether those colonial powers were France, or the United Kingdom, or Belgium, or Spain, or Portugal, they would come. Kwame Nkrumah may not have been a prophet, but his words were prophetic. Kwame Nkrumah may not have had the foresight of a Jewish prophet, but when one looks at Africa today, one can see very clearly that the neo-colonial project is alive and well, despite our protestations to the contrary. If you go to the so-called Francophone. And let me pause for a moment and remind us that we are the only continent in the world which Western Europe, and when I talk about Western Europe, I'm talking about the conceptual West. The conceptual West extends beyond the continent of Europe, refers to us as Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, Lusophone Africa. So Uganda is Anglophone. Notwithstanding that not more than 30% speak English, you are Anglophone. In Cote d'Ivoire is Francophone. Notwithstanding that not more than 30% can speak French. Nigeria is Anglophone. Notwithstanding that there are over 500 local languages, Nigeria is Anglophone. Angola is Lusophone, and so is Mozambique. That is where we find ourselves. One may ask, what has that to do with the subject that I've been invited to speak about, the commercialization of politics? It has everything to do with it. Because if we don't have that sense of history, we cannot appreciate why politics has changed its face over the years. So we regained our independence, but no sooner had we settled in our independence than we started seeing the disruption of that independence. As early as 1961, the man for whom I am named, Patrice Emery Lumumba, barely 9 months in office, was removed from power, and the Democratic Republic of Congo has never been the same again. Barely 1 year in office, Togo's Sylvanus Olympia was removed. A few years into office, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah was uprooted. A few years in office, Nigeria's Nnamdi Azikiwe was eliminated. And when you look at some of these removals and/or elimination, they were clearly choreographed. When the leaders were careful to ensure that they were moving to liberate their people, it is now common knowledge that Western agencies orchestrated their removal from office. They invaded our barracks, and at one time it was being said of many African countries that coups were as frequent as breakfast. But the truth and the unfortunate thing that in many of those countries, even breakfast was not that frequent. So that we were never able to settle down. Then, of course, we had leaders who, upon ascending to power in Africa, became demigods. How many of you here will forget Mobutu Sese Seko? How many of you here will forget Jean Bedel Bokassa? How many of you here will forget Samuel Doe? And then we had the emergence of guerrilla movements where people rose against their very own who had used their positions of power to destroy what had been gained over the years. Uganda was not immune. You are victimized by coup d'etats. You are victimized by monster leaders. And then in 1986, you had the NRA, NRM storming into Uganda and acquiring power and subsequently converting itself into a political party, which has continued to reign supreme and to bestride the Ugandan political scene like the fabled Colossus. And Uganda was not the only one. In Ethiopia, it was the same thing. In Zimbabwe, it was the same thing. There is a sense in which there was the realization that in order to change your fortunes, you must do something about it in addition to praying about it. Because prayer without action is simply superstition. And then, in those early days, you will also remember that many African leaders, including the enlightened ones, took the view that because of ethnicity, it was necessary to unite the people. And whether you are speaking from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or Lusaka in Zambia, or Kinshasa in what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, or you are speaking from Nairobi in Kenya, and here in Uganda, the clarion call was that we must have one-party states. And the justification for one-party states was that we are so disunited, there are so many ethnicities, that if we allow multi-party politics, then what would happen to us is that we would be negatively ethnicized and that we would break our countries, and that therefore, to ensure that there was unity, we needed one umbrella under whose auspices and under whose guidance the people would be united. But no sooner had we sufficiently articulated the beauty of single-party states than Western Europe told us, no, that is not democracy. Democracy means that you must have many political parties. Democracy means that you must have regular elections. Democracy means that you must have the civil society, so that our brand of democracy as we embrace it today, I dare say without fear of contradiction, was not conceived in Africa. It was conceived for us in Paris. It was conceived for us in Madrid. It was conceived for us in London. It was conceived for us in Washington. And we have swallowed it line, hook, and sinker. Africa does not tell our own story. Africa does not design what is in our best interest. Africa still waits to be told what is good and right. And I dare say that that is why Africa does not realize our potential. But yet it is also important to point out that the African and African countries are more resilient than the European states. You know, if you allow me latitude as a guest must be allowed, permit me to say this. The ethnicity that we keep on talking about, African countries are just slightly over 60 years since they regained their independence. Take Nigeria, for example, with over 500 ethnic groups created within an artificial boundary. They have had their problems, they have had their hiccups, but the nation is still alive and well. The difficulties notwithstanding. Take Uganda, for example. You've had your difficulties, you've had your trials and tribulations, but the nation is still alive and well. Tanzania, with over 136 ethnic groups, the nation is still alive and well. There is a sense in which, in the face of our difficulties, we have succeeded in managing those difficulties, however painful it has been. But look at Europe, the pontificating Europe. They cannot handle diversity. They cannot. And it's important to remind ourselves this, if only to energize ourselves. The Europeans have had to fight two major tribal wars. They called them world wars. They were tribal wars. The European tribes were at war with each other in 1914. They may have recruited a few Africans and a few other people, and then they call it World War. Then they had another major tribal war in 1939 through to 1945. They didn't call them tribal wars, they called them world wars. And I want you to look at Europe and the purity of their nation. If you go to Sweden, the nation is almost 90% composed of the Swedes. with a small lapse population, and for that small population, they even have a separate parliament for them. That is how they handle it. You go to Finland, 90% of Finland are the Finns, with small Swedish population. You go to the Netherlands, the same. You go to England or the Great Britain, whether he's great or not, I do not know, but he's the Great Britain. Even there, if you talk to the Scots, they have something to say about the English. If you talk to the Irish, they have something to say. If you talk to the Welsh, they have something to say. Go to Spain, where there are a few more tribes, they had a civil war. Go to Italy, largely the Italians. And you walk across to Eastern Europe. Yugoslavia was united as one nation under Joseph Broz Tito. Did they not produce many countries during our lifetime? The Soviet Union has given birth to many countries. They have gone into ethnic purity. Africa remains the only continent on earth that somehow, having had artificial boundaries imposed on her, saying that we will retain those boundaries and make the best of it, and one need only go to the pronouncements in 1963, the pronouncements of Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Kambarage Nyerere on the inviolability of the boundaries, repeated again in 1964 in Cairo, in Egypt, that if we choose to redraw these boundaries, Africa will be perpetually at conflict, and therefore heavens have given us a lemon. Let us not ask for an orange. Let us make a lemonade unto ourselves. And we are making the lemonade. So today, to go back to our subject, in 1989, the Soviet Union collapses. So the world is no longer bipolar. The world is unipolar. The conceptual West has won the day. So Africa must now begin to identify how to behave. We are not ready. We are told that we must democratize. And democratization means that we must have new constitutions. So Uganda has a constitution in 1995. So Ethiopia has a constitution in 1984. So Malawi has a constitution. So Nigeria has a constitution in 1979. Ghana has a new constitution. Guinea-Bissau has a new constitution. The former Portuguese colonies have now regained their independence, whether it's Cape Verde or Angola or Mozambique, so that the former French colonies also have new constitution. But remember that the constitution that they are replacing, and Africa is the only continent where our constitutions prior to then were referred to, if you are colonized by the English, our constitutions were referred to as the Westminster model, not the Kampala model, Westminster model. The French constitutions were referred to as the Gaullist model after the 1958 pronouncement of Charles de Gaulle of France. That is where we find ourselves. In 1989, we are now told that we must have constitutions which are democratic. So we all have constitutions, and one of the pillars of democracy is that we must have multi-party politics. That is the touchstone. That is the litmus test of what a democracy is, as seen from the eyes of the conceptual West. Do we have a choice in the matter? No, we don't have a choice in the matter. We may pretend to have a choice, but we have no choice. Because Big Brother, World Bank, and IMF are breathing down us and telling us, you either do this or we do you. So they come in the 1980s with structural adjustment, and we do as they want. Here in Uganda, I hear President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni arguing ever so eloquently that Uganda, given our history, can only survive on the basis of a no-party system. But I hear the West telling him equally eloquently and a little bit more forcefully that we do not agree with you. We do not agree with you, and your safety not only requires but demands that you must reintroduce multi-party politics. So Yoweri Kaguta Museveni concedes. And he's not the only one who is conceding. Everywhere we are conceding. Ultimately, all the countries now have plural party politics. And that is where the commercialization of politics begins. That is where money enters into the political arena. That is where we begin to eliminate ideas from politics, and we now ask ourselves, who is the leader? And now that is the time when people get into political office for the purpose of feathering their nests, because the electoral process becomes an expensive process, and that is where we begin to lose our direction. So as I speak today, one of the greatest qualifications in African politics is the size of your pocket. You know, in 1995, the then Tanzanian former head of state, Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere, was invited by his party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, to speak about who was to be the leader to succeed his successor, Ali Hassan Mwinyi. He took his audience down memory lane. He reminded his audience that when they led the nation from colonization, the prime motivator was that they would liberate their people. They were servant leaders, he said. Speaking of Tanzania, he said, we met in Arusha and came up with the Arusha Declaration. And in the Arusha Declaration, we said that in order to be a leader, there must be some ideals that govern you, and there must be some taboos which you must never embrace in order to be a true leader. He said that in those days when you joined politics and you had a lot of money, the people would ask, where have you gotten the money from? He reminded his audience that in those days, when you went to the public and you appeared to have more money than you could legitimately explain, the electorate would say, you are a thief, and they would not elect you. But he regretted in 1995 that things had changed and that the major qualification was how much money you had. And the more money you had, the more attractive you are to the electorate. In other words, the cancer of money and the politics of money and money bags reared its ugly head after the advent of multi-party politics. And I want to say that is now comfortably sitting in the bedrooms and in the sitting rooms of our political parties. How can we liberate ourselves from it, and what is it? You know, what I'm about to say is neo-Marxist, but I'm not myself a Marxist, and I've never been one. But the Marxists had beautiful slogans, one of which was, the safety of the bourgeois demands that the proletariat be kept in the most profound ignorance. If I step it down into English, it simply means that the safety of the leader demands that the people be kept in poverty. And that is what happens in Africa. In Europe and America, during elections, they go around kissing babies and appearing to be nice. In Africa, they go around distributing rice and maize, appearing to be nice. In other words, the typical African politician impoverishes the people so that they may become attractive to them. And in order to be attractive, you must appear to have money. And this is why those in the political arena in many African countries have an insatiable appetite for things. Primitive accumulation of things is the rule in many African countries. A friend of mine once corrected me when I said that in Africa there is corruption. He said, no, in Africa there is no corruption. Corruption presupposes there is some element of intelligence in theft. What we see in Africa is looting and theft on an industrial scale. And what I'm saying is not new to us. I never knew myself that there is any magic in the ballot box, that today, if I'm a pauper, upon being elected as a councillor or a member of parliament, suddenly my life changes dramatically. In fact, you younger people are now in the business of betting whether one English football team will beat the other, which I discourage. That is not where the jackpot lies. The jackpot lies in you are being elected a member of parliament in many African countries. If you are elected a member of parliament or a councillor in many African countries, that is your passport to El Dorado, the land of gold. And the reason why that appetite is ever so sharpened, the members of parliament who are here will tell you that when they want to retreat to their rural homes like they will on Friday, they cannot just walk into their rural homes. There will be droves of people waiting for them. And when their cars are seen, they say, behold, the mobile ATM has arrived. Behold. And therefore, when one is appointed into any public office, because of the demands of the electorate, and this relationship between the African member of parliament or the African president and the electorate is a symbiotic relationship. It is symbiotic in a very perverse manner. And I suspect I'm misusing the word symbiotic, but I'll use it or misuse it nevertheless, to the extent that it explains my point. What happens is that it appears that the electorate has allowed the so-called leader, because many of them are misleaders, to remain in their positions of power and to acquire as much as they can, on the understanding that periodically their loot will be shared with them. It is some kind of Robin Hoodism of a latter-day kind. And this Robin Hood kind of politics is a little bit different, at least from my understanding. Robin Hood robbed the rich in order to share with the poor. But our latter-day African Robin Hoods are in the business of robbing from the poor in order to give a pittance to the very poor. And this is what we are talking about today when we talk about commercialization. So that if you ask any typical African politician, how much does it cost you to be elected into parliament, they'll tell you it is in the millions. It is in the millions, and the millions they spend is perhaps 10 times more than they'll ever earn through their legitimate salaries. And I ask myself, if your salary in 5 years is going to be 1 billion Ugandan shillings, why should you spend 5 billion Ugandan shillings to get into that office? There must be something that we do not see, but you see, and I know what it is. What it is that getting into the office of the member of parliament, or indeed any other political office in Africa, is a guarantee that things will come. So that in many African countries, the politician is the major tenderpreneur. The politician is the gatekeeper. The politician is the one who receives the guests. He is the tax collector informally, aside from the URA. And in this regard, therefore, we must commercialize politics. We may blame the politicians, But what about the electorate? The electorate also is to be blamed. The electorate has insatiable thirst and hunger for things that they have not worked for. They have been trained and they no longer listen to ideas. My good friend Norbert Mao, who I was told was here, I do not know whether he is here, will tell you, not that I have talked to him this morning, but he'll tell you that one of the pains that one has to endure when you confront your typical African electorate is to convince the electorate that ideas count for something. Many times when you address the electorate and you are waxing eloquent, telling them, when I'm elected, I'm going to ensure that we have good health services. We are going to ensure that we have good schools. We are going to ensure that we create opportunities for innovation and invention and create opportunities for young men and women. They are waiting for you to finish. They will tell you, we hear you. We know you are going to do all those beautiful things. But in the intervening period, I must eat. And therefore, no matter how beautiful your ideas are, if you don't carry money on that day, your ideas, like the elephant before them, will never fly. So, today we are gathered here to remind ourselves that when politics is commercialized, it harms the people. It undermines democracy. When competition is not about ideas, it's about who has the deepest pocket, then the country cannot grow. I'm therefore this morning submitting to us that we are in a bad space in many African countries as regards the quality of the politics that we operate. And it's not lost on me that in many African countries today, politics is about life and death. And the competition is cutthroat competition, and throats are actually cut. I'm not speaking figuratively. Throats are actually cut in political contest. Has it not been lost on you that in the recent past, in very few African countries, do you ever hear in many African countries that a loser has picked a phone and called the winner and said, brother, we had a good competition. The people spoke. The lingua franca after every African election is won. The elections have been stolen. They have been rigged. So in Africa, elections are either stolen or rigged. They are never lost nor won. And why? The reason is very simple. It is cutthroat. It is not a competition of ideas. It is a competition for occupying a lucrative casino so that the political office, the state house, or the government house is a casino where gambling is perpetuated on a daily basis. And everyone wants to be in control of that casino. So until the day that we are able, Mwalimu Nyerere saw these things. He said that State House is a holy place. He said, in Kiswahili, he said it better. He said, Ikulu ni mahali patakatifu. Ikulu ni mahali patakatifu. The State House is a holy place, and we must never convert it into a den of thieves. And one can extend that to Parliament. Parliament is a holy place, and it must not be a den of thieves. We must not build governments where we have Alibaba and 40 thieves. In fact, they are no longer 40. Since Alibaba went there, we now have Alibabas and many other thieves. Until we eliminate Alibabaism from our politics, we are going nowhere. And as I conclude, I want to submit to us that there are ways of ensuring that we eliminate commercialization from the political arena. I know that there are many things that have been done in different countries. There were times when we thought that we should limit electoral expenditure, which is a good thing. We ask people how much you spend in election. We know what it is that would be expended when you are a presidential candidate, when you are a member of parliament, when you are a councillor, but there is a sense in which Chinua Achebe was right. Chinua Achebe, writing in 1958, said of a bird amongst his Igbo people that since man has learned to shoot without missing, Eneke the bird has learned to fly without perching. So there is a sense in which now that we have made the laws, the politicians have also perfected the art of ensuring that they expend beyond the prescribed expenditure without being caught. But that is a step in the right direction. The other one is sensitization of the people. The people themselves must be sensitized. I said at the outset that one of the problems in Africa is the assumption, and I want to repeat to us, perhaps we are the better lot, but there is a sense in Africa in which the politician, whether they say it or not, actually believe that we, the electorate, are a bunch of nincompoops. They believe so. Many African politicians actually hold the electorate in great contempt. They think we don't think. And because they have hypnotized us in countries where ethnicity has taken root, they remind us that, you know, if you elect me, then our tribe is safe. If you elect me, then it is our tribe's turn to eat. So we believe that even if he is a thief, he is our own thief. I'm saying that what we must realize, whether we are in Uganda, whether we are in Kenya or Ethiopia, what we must recognize is that going forward, when we don't have good roads, those good roads, when we don't have good roads, the bad roads will affect all of us. It doesn't matter which tribe you come from. When you can't get medicine in hospital, it is not because of your tribe that you'll get treated. When you don't have good schools, the schools are bad for everybody. And therefore, the time for us is to wake up. You know, I'm now beginning to see people waking up. Look at what is happening in Algeria. The Algerians are telling their leader, oh, you may have been God's gift to us, but even the gods are now tired. And it's not only in Algeria that they are saying that. In Sudan, they are telling the Sudan, we know that you may have been God's gift, but the gods now want you. In South Sudan, which has been at ease for a long, has not been at ease for a long time, just this weekend, the two leaders have now recognized that the matter is very spiritual. They have gone to the Vatican for a spiritual retreat. Things are beginning to get serious. And ladies and gentlemen, Africa can be great. Africa must be great. But in order for Africa to be great, we must inject what I've called at a different setting, we must inject hygiene in our politics. And there is something to learn from every civilization. One of the things that we can learn from the Western countries, which is positive, is that to a large extent they have now made competition in their political arena a competition of ideas. So that in many Western countries, a leader sees public office as an opportunity for service. So that when there is a vote in the United Kingdom as to whether they should leave or not, and they vote to leave, the young David Cameron leaves office. Can you imagine an African president saying, I'm now resigning because I lost a vote? He'll say, I did not vote. It is the people who voted. They do it, and there is something to learn from it. Look at what is happening again in that area of Brexit. Their prime minister saying, if you approve my plan, I will leave office. Oh, Mother Africa, where are your sons and daughters who are capable of saying that, Mother Africa? We can learn from the West. That is a competition of ideas. Go to countries such as the Netherlands. The prime minister rides to work. Oh, Africa. If you should see the convoy of an African minister, not a president, I'm not touching the presidents. The presidents are in a different world. The African minister. The African minister will never queue. Oh, he's anathemic. Oh, the African minister is a demigod. Oh, Africa. The African counselor in your rural home, when they go to churches, not even if it is not their denomination, they saunter to the front seats. And even our latter-day clergymen will invite them to share their wisdom with the people, even if we know that they are village fools. If there is anything that we must learn from Western Europe, is that they have gone through enough problems and they are capable of organizing their affairs, and they have demystified political leadership. We must demystify political leadership going forward. And once we do that, and I think we can do it because I can now begin to see something happening in Africa. Young Africans are beginning to ask searching questions. Africans are beginning to recognize that corruption is a cancer in our body politic. They are beginning to recognize that those who want to buy their votes don't mean well for them. They are beginning to recognize that there is enough money to change their lives if the thieves are eliminated from the political arena. They are beginning to realize that commercialization of politics is a threat to democracy. They are beginning to rise up. And I think that those who have not smelled the coffee will be surprised. They will be surprised when the ground moves from under their feet. They'll be surprised when Africa begins to elect individuals who can demonstrate that they have ideas, because the politics of the 21st century is the politics of ideas and about competition of ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, one can go on and on in such things, but there is no wisdom in flogging a dead horse. As I said at the beginning, I claim no authority on these matters. I merely share my thoughts with you in the hope and the belief that after this, there will be an exercise in cross-fertilization and cross-pollination. I rest my case. God bless.